Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Jonathan Wells to discuss The Skinny, a memoir, published by our friends at Z Books. Jonathan Wells has published 3 poetry collections, Debris, Train Dance, and The Man with Many Pens. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, and the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day program, and many other journals. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by the publisher of Z Books, Michael Zilkha. Michael started Z Books in 2019. Prior to that, he was involved in natural gas exploration and then renewable energy in Houston, Texas, where he has lived since 1986. From 1978 to 1984, he ran Z Records in New York City. Michael had several jobs in magazine publishing when he first moved to New York and spent 2 years as an editor at Atlantic Monthly Press under Harold Evans. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. So put in your questions as you listen, and you can order your copy of The Skinny from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to introduce John now. So I started Z Books 3 years ago, specifically to honor my friend Glenn O'Brien, who had recently died. My ambition was to have the New York Review of Books take notice of his work, and we did get reviewed there. Since Intelligence for Dummies came out, we have also published in our book series Nick Flynn and John Bradshaw, another one of my mentors. John Wells's The Skinny is something else, a standalone memoir rather than a compendium of assorted writing and images. It is particularly dear to my heart because John and I were close friends through most of the period he documents in his book. I was suffering from slightly different but related body issues, and yet we discussed neither my anxieties nor the painful events that John describes in his memoir. It was a more repressed era, more difficult to gather information or find a community of friends to open up to, and I guess that neither of us felt secure enough to confide in anyone, even in each other. So publishing John's book is very meaningful to me. It's a story other young men and women have also lived, and it is my hope that The Skinny will help assuage some of the pain that repressing shame can engender. The story John tells in The Skinny is not peculiar to being slight. Mortification and paralysis can be triggered by many different physical and emotional conditions. So on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce John, who is going to start by reading an excerpt from The Skinny.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Christina, and Books and Books. The first part I'm going to read occurs at the beginning of the book, after an episode at a new school where one of my teachers thought I was too thin and acted on it. My father was angry at the school and wanted to intervene to help. So he started with a program of exercises and diets, and those lasted a while. I wasn't too interested, but I did them in a perfunctory way. And then he wanted my mother to take me to doctors. So The first person he took me to was my orthodontist, who had a measurement system using my gum line and the length of my dental roots, which showed that I was going to be 6'2" and 175 pounds. I didn't believe it. My father didn't believe it. So he asked my mother to take us to my normal pediatrician, Dr. Diamond. And that's where this begins. A week later, Mom took me to Dr. Diamond, my pediatrician, whose office was in Chappaqua on the ground floor of an old Victorian house where the floorboards squeaked. He was as interested in his patients' young minds as he was in their bodies, and always asked what books we were reading and what we thought about them. His full head of dull white hair and the bright look in his blue eyes suggested he had an almost mystical wisdom to impart. My mother explained why we were there and the orthodontist's calculation. Dr. Diamond listened and didn't say anything. He asked me to take my shirt off and felt the bones in my forearm carefully and knowingly, as if there might be deep meaning inside them. "Let's see what you weigh first," he said. I stepped on the scale and saw the silver marker nudge just past the 50-pound mark. He looked at the records of my previous visit. "About the same as before, Jean. There is some science to support what your Dr. Brewer said, but not much." He paused and smiled. "So, John, how much would you like to weigh? How tall would you like to be?" he asked, as if I had a say in the matter. The idea that I might have my own vision for what I wanted my weight to be had never occurred to me before. I didn't know what the right answer was, or if there even was one. "Well," I said, "I guess the same size as my parents, and one day I'd like to be over 100 pounds, I mumbled, as if I were grasping for a number that would make them pleased with me. But as soon as I said the words 100 pounds, the shapes of the numbers lit up in my mind with a fluorescent satisfaction that announced something improbable, almost surreal, like the year 2000. I repeated it, and it felt like it was almost mine, even if it had been inspired by my wish to placate them. I wanted to weigh 100 pounds. The assertion didn't fit me immediately, but it felt like a vow that I could come to believe in. Just the images of the 1 followed by 2 zeros made me proud of myself, although I didn't weigh an ounce more. Their approving looks confirmed that I had chosen well. "That's a good answer, John," Dr. Diamond said. "You be what you're going to be. Stop worrying about him, Jean. He'll be fine." He looked at my mother reproachfully. But after that burst of enthusiasm, my father's exercise program, the chocolate milkshakes, and the constant exhortations to eat just a little bit more, only 2 bites, how about 3 with an extra one for Grandma Ida, took their toll. Rather than making me feel that I was on the verge of a new, expansive future, the constant command to eat gave me the impression that I was falling further behind, and my situation was deteriorating. This increased my doubts about the enterprise and made my father's vision for me seem unlikely, unachievable. I wanted to ask him why he wouldn't let me reach my natural weight by myself. Why did I have to try so hard to do something that I had only a passing interest in? Why did he need to impose it on me? Many nights, when I lay awake in bed on the top bunk, thinking about these questions, I imagined myself without a distinct body. I could feel my fingers and my toes, but I had no sense of my overall size. In the pitch blackness, I could stretch any part of my body at will, or instead of being my usual shape, I could be no shape, a protoplasm, and this amorphous state felt better to me. It contained no basis for comparison, no hierarchy, no trace of mockery or intimidation. In this formlessness, my fears about myself became solvable and bearable. The darkness offered a refuge from criticism, and I lay awake reveling in it. That's the end of that scene.
Thank you, John. let's start with how did you start writing this book? What prompted you to write it?
Well, I'd been working intensely on my second collection of poems, The Man with Many Pens, and I'd handed it in. My publisher had accepted it, and it was an intense bit of work. So I wanted something that would be easy, like a lark. And I thought, let's write something funny. Let's write, a series of skits, and everybody'd always found my weight hilarious. So my friends, my wife when we first met. So I thought, well, I'll just string a few of these episodes together, and it'll be fun. It'll be fun to write. It'll be light and breezy. So I started with that attitude in mind.
And did you produce a draft that was fun and breezy?
Sort of. Not, it started to get a lot less breezy the more I worked on it, because I started to connect the dots to what thinness meant and people's preoccupation with it and so on. So, but then I started to get serious about it and worked on the drafts and draft after draft to make it better and tighter and righter and so on, but still leaving in, the humor that originated with the book and with the idea.
Well, there are many funny passages in the book.
Well, my father had a great sense of humor. Sometimes it was mockery and sometimes it wasn't. And, we used to compete at the dinner table to make him laugh. So humor was bred in us from early on. And it became, an area of competition almost between me and my siblings, And he would say, he would sort of judge our jokes, say, no, that's not funny, and so on.
When did the book start taking a more serious tone?
I'd written maybe 4 drafts and got it to the point where I liked it. I liked the pace. I liked the detail. I liked the language. And I gave it to a great friend, a writer friend who I admired, to read. And he looked at it and he said, well, this is pretty good, but you've left out everything important. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there's no emotion in the book. There's no emotion on how you felt as these events occur. And I knew he was right. Instantly, I knew he was right. But I didn't know where the emotion should go. I didn't know what it was. And I got an editor to help me go through the book to understand not what the emotion should be so much. That I had to rediscover for myself, but where it should go. I didn't know that it was okay to have feelings, negative feelings, feelings of anger, or that I'd been encroached upon or anything like that. I didn't. And so the editor went through it and she found, so many places, what did you feel? And they weren't all negative emotions, although there were plenty of those. But, so that took me years, because I had to, in a way, re-immerse myself in situation after situation to try and reimagine and what I must have felt. So
was it harder once you were really putting yourself into it, as opposed to it just being a recap of?
Oh, it was agony. It was, it stopped being funny. It really stopped being funny. And I realized that some of the things were really bad and damaging. And some of the things that I did as a result of the experiences were bad and damaging too. So I had to come to a reckoning with that as well. And, it hadn't been my intention to be hurtful, but because of the situation, in a way, that's who I had become. I sort of was tied up in knots and toxic and and that was, when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. So that was really tough. It was very tough to, in a way, relive the experience in order to excavate it.
Had you ever dealt with any of this in therapy or discussed it with friends? Because we never discussed any of this.
No. I didn't discuss it with anyone. And, just to give you an example, I mean, we never talked about it when we knew each other back in our teenage years, and it wasn't done. We just didn't, there wasn't the openness or candor that, we'd like to think exists now. And when I gave my brother the first chapter of the book to read, he'd gone to the same school that I had, and he read it, and he called me almost immediately and said, "Oh my God, that teacher did that to you too?" In other words, in 40 years, 30 years, it had never come up. We'd never even discussed it. And recently I've been in touch with other people who were at the school at the same time, and they'd had similar experiences. I mean, this is part of, what's happening in the world today. I mean, with, recovered memory is a dicey word, but it's happening in other areas too, where, these things are now discussable.
Well, there was also an image of strength that you had to project, and of if you were vulnerable, particularly in those schools, that vulnerability would be exploited by other kids.
Absolutely. I mean, and I don't know about you, but back then I knew that. I knew there were guys who were big, much bigger and stronger, heavier, all that than I was. And I did their French homework. I did their homework for them because I thought it was kind of like a racket of protection, because, they would, in my school, they would protect the guy who helped them with their English homework.
Right. It's sort of like being in prison.
Right. It's like, having the thugs on your side.
Yes.
Or some of them.
So, what I think a lot about the dynamic with this is a lot about your life with your parents, and of course, three siblings as well. As you said, you compete at the table. Were you aware of the triangulation between you and your mom and dad at the time, and how you were a pawn in a way, and how they worked through their relationship?
I felt there were stresses, Michael. I felt being pulled, by my mother to poetry and literature. And being pulled by my father to business, to the business world, which he was successful and active in, and like trying to decide, which was I, and who should I please, and is it set or does it vacillate? And so I kept feeling like they were, one was tugging on one arm and the other was tugging on the other arm. But I didn't at the time understand it more profoundly as I did over, with this from this perspective. And, you know, I'm sure you know the Kierkegaard quote that life can only be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards. Or, I mean, that's my paraphrase of it.
Right.
And so then, you know, with the advantages of age and time, the triangulation took on much greater significance and substance. So,
right. And was the experience different for your siblings? Because Tommy was small too.
it was. I mean, you know, I think being the firstborn has advantages and disadvantages, and being the secondborn has different advantages and disadvantages. And so, you know, I have 4 kids, and you know, you react to each kid differently, and you have a different relationship with each child in a way, as much as you think you're the same. And with my parents, it wasn't that they had favorites or not favorites. I mean, it was that they were different people with each child. And so
I do remember how much I loved being with your family, because it felt like they were a real family. And of course, my parents were divorced, and we didn't have, you know, the contact that we had with our parents was generally on their terms. You know, it was fun. I loved being with my dad as he was building his business, but that was how we related. And at the table, at dinner, we would talk about it, and we would talk about the products, you know, in the store, and so, and that was the life. So it was really on his terms. And when I first came to stay with your family, it seemed like something I'd never seen before, and I didn't want to leave because it felt so whole and so full. And of course, since we weren't discussing any of the things that were going on, that sort of, you know, I could feel that illusion. It did look perfect from the outside. Right.
You know, and as you know, it's as many people's lives do on Instagram today. You know, you know, they do look perfect from the outside, and the less you know, the better. And you know, I and all of the things that I describe in the book that happen, and there's some really not difficult, bad ones, but you know, I feel that those don't dissipate the feeling of love I have for my parents. They made some mistakes. They weren't really intentional, or they were mistakes made through good intentions. I see that now. You know, I mean, at times it didn't feel that way. I mean,
well, and some of them would qualify as abuse.
Yeah, well, you know, abuse, it's a broad word. I don't know if it, you know,
a 14-year-old to a prostitute.
Well, you know, now that would be considered a felony. But back then, in the 1960s, was it a felony? No. You know, it was a bad idea, but you know, and especially in the way in which it was done. But it you know, it wasn't. Now it's a class 3 felony to interfere with a minor, even a parent, as I learned recently. So,
would you like to read another passage now?
Yeah, I want to read a part about being with my father in his car, which he took in and out of the city. He was driven in and out from where we lived in northern Westchester to his office, in and out each day. And in there, he would sort of dispense his wisdom. So, and guidance in a sort of in a natural way. So I'd like to read a couple of places from that. The Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham that took my father in and out of New York City each day offered more than transportation. The back seat was his sanctuary, where he could spend an uninterrupted hour alone. Occasionally, he paged through the New York Times and thumbed the stacks of business papers that he brought home each night. Mostly, they stayed unread inside his briefcase as he stared out the window and listened to Bach's unaccompanied cello suites, played by János Starker, his favorite music. Being alone with him in his car, traveling into what I considered his city, was a rare privilege. Attilio, his giant Neapolitan driver, steered the car along the route my father had selected, his mournful clown's face with spiky black hair beaming into the back seat via the rearview mirror. Dad was very precise in his driving instructions to Attilio. Always pump the brakes, never stomp on them. Remember, they are as sensitive as you are, he said. It was difficult for me to imagine that someone as big as Attilio could be sensitive. His height and girth made him seem invulnerable. Anticipate the turns. Don't yank the wheel, my dad repeated frequently, for my sake as a future driver, as well as Attilio's. The car was also his lecture hall, his pulpit, and he was uncharacteristically serious when we were alone there. He handed down his opinions and advice in a straightforward way without anyone to modify them or contradict him. After Dad had heard the details of my visit with Dr. Diamond over a meal of blanquette de veau that no one liked, he told us that he'd made an appointment for me to see an endocrinologist in Manhattan. This didn't mean that he didn't have faith in Dr. Diamond's opinion, but he wanted confirmation. We're not going to put all our chips on that orthodontist of yours or Dr. Diamond, he said. I want you to see Dr. Ensler for a full workup. Some friends told me he has access to a special growth hormone. I think we ought to hear what he has to say, no? He said, ending his comment with a question, as he often did, to be sure there was no possibility of a misunderstanding. I'd never heard of Dr. Ensler before and didn't care what he had to offer, so long as the visit provided me the chance to explore the city and be alone with my father in the car. What does an endocrinologist do? I asked him. Well, I don't know about other endocrinologists, Dad said, but this hormone Ensler found might give you a few extra inches. You wouldn't turn that down, would you? Of course not, I answered, not sure what I was risking. To emphasize his view of me as too thin, too short, and too impractical, Dad had started calling me his Luftmensch, the Yiddish word meaning a combination of man and air, a dreamer, a man with his head in the clouds. That is what you are, John, he said to me, as if it were a proof of my condition, a boy of the air. You are so light that your feet barely touch the ground. I'm not even sure you know what the ground is, do you? He asked, lowering his head a notch and looking up at me with his brown eyes, sympathetic, but with a wry, skeptical twist. The Luftmensch, he continued, wanders from place to place without leaving a footprint. That is what he did in the old days. He skimmed the surface of the earth as if he had no gravity, no idea what gravity was or why it was important to be part of the earth. He had no job, no shop. He told stories as he traveled from town to town, passing gossip off as information. Luftmensch became my regular nickname. When my growth spurt began, my limbs were uncoordinated, as though they weren't completely under my control. I tripped in odd places where he couldn't see anything to trip over, and he laughed at me. When I saw how big a laugh the gag got from him, I did it again, but this time on purpose, like a vaudevillian honing his craft. He laughed, and I laughed with him, not because it was funny, but because I thought I was fooling him into thinking it had been an accident. On another car ride with my father, he had cocked his head slightly and said, I've been watching you, and I think you're taking too long on each page you're reading. Are you reading every word? He asked. I looked at him, surprised that reading didn't mean that each word counted. Is that wrong? I asked. Well, not wrong exactly, but who has time for the little words? Do you really need the, and, if, or helper verbs? Does the tense really matter? Those won't give you the gist of it. They can be skipped, and you won't be missing much. He examined me to make sure I was following him closely. No articles, prepositions, or pronouns is my motto. They just get in the way and jumble up the sentence. You need to get to the meat as quickly as possible. It's like when I take you to a restaurant. Do I say eat the vegetables and potatoes first? No, I say eat what I'm paying for. I'm paying for the meat. Ignore the vegetables. If you take all of those bitty words out, you'll reach the same conclusion. That's vertical reading. Horizontal is for scholars. You don't want to be a horizontalist, do you? He asked, daring me to say yes.
Wow.
And by the way, when you're remembering stuff from back then, some stuff, isn't quite clear and you pat it. This is verbatim. This is really, this isn't fudged. It's like or decorated. That's quoting.
Right.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the time and how much you think this story is of the time? And
well, I think it's very much of its time. I mean, my father, like in the United States and other countries, my father had been in the Army and the Air Force during World War II. He'd been shaped by military experience, even though he'd never gone overseas. And there was a kind of formality and discipline there. And when the war ended and they went to work and they were ambitious and wanted to, start businesses and build lives, I mean, those were their guiding principles, not military ones alone, but the self-discipline and the focus on detail and those things. I think some of that did derive from his experiences, and and I think that as the firstborn, I mean, he saw me as his cadet, in a way, and wanted to impart those principles to me, and I just happened to have no interest in them. I grew up in a very different, by the time I was in my teens, my father was successful. His business was doing well, and he was traveling the world, and he had, he was sure of himself, and as the book goes on, that ebbs. But at the time that the book begins, in my teenage years, and that was the exciting life of the 50s and 60s until the late 60s, when things started to go sideways. And I often thought, well, if Don Draper's son wrote a book, is this what it would be like?
Mm-hmm.
Is this the other end of Mad Men? And that some people have mentioned that, and interestingly enough, or coincidentally, I went to the same elementary school as Don Draper's kids.
At the same time, or?
Well, I don't know. Close enough.
Close enough, yeah. So it's the same.
Yeah, they were in Ossining, and I went to an Ossining elementary school in Westchester. So it has a sort of an uncanny tracking.
Right. Gosh, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. So and I mean, suburban life was considered grand. I mean, people who lived in the city, I mean, had made compromises, with that life that my parents hadn't wanted to make, and so suburban life then was grand, and growing up in the suburbs, the fascination with the city is immense. Seeing your father disappear there. What is he doing there? Well, we don't really know, but he comes back, or seems to come back every night. We get to go to his office. Well, that felt like, going to heaven. And in the city, everything is accessible without your mother having to drive you. You can walk around the corner to the bookstore or the record store, and that, was paradise. So those, my experiences do reflect and mirror those times, obviously.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the reception of the book so far, because you've given it to friends and family, and I don't know whether anyone you don't know has read it yet and told you that they read it. But...
Well, many people I don't know have read it now, and the people who know me, there are parts which are difficult for them to read. People who don't know me don't care. They can empathize perhaps or whatever, but it's more that they're, I think that their curiosity is gripped by the experiences and hopefully what I do with them in the book and how I come to understand them, and how as time goes on, how I understand them differently. And also, how I use them. I mean, there were bad things that were done to me, but I used them, I thought, at least at the time, I was being so clever and using them to my advantage.
Right. Do you think this book can resonate with kids today, or do you think it's so much of its time that...
It's evocative of its time for sure, but I don't think it's limited by its time. And I've had many younger people read it who just loved it. I mean, and who couldn't, in their 20s and 30s, and people who, I look at and thought, you weren't thin, you weren't small, you were never small. So what is this book saying to you?
Mm-hmm.
I wish, I haven't got an answer to the people I don't speak to, but, but clearly something in the book is crosses a lot of categories. In other words, it's not just people who are thin, or as you said in your introduction, it's people who have felt shame in some way. There was something hidden that they don't want to talk about. That was uncomfortable, that's embarrassing. And that's, the thinness is coincidental. It's my, that happens to be my story, but, and dealt with in this way. But.
And do you think people feel shame in the same way in this sort of culture where everything is, so upfront, and you can discover anything on the internet, basically?
I don't think anything, even the internet, will eliminate shame. I think there's so many potential sources for it, that it's too big. I mean, it's too big a feeling, and it's too much a part of struggles between people. And I don't, I'd love to say, this is the end of shame, but I can't imagine that. And I think that, but there's something else in the book that maybe is useful to point out here. And that is that I think that what I was trying to get at in the trajectory of the story, and why I started where I did and ended it where I did, was because I think that over the course of time of the book, that somehow I've learned to love someone else. And meaning that I've learned to love myself enough to recognize someone else's love. And that wasn't obvious at the beginning of the story. I mean, it was not, that would have been a far-fetched idea. And that's one of the reasons why I picked as an epigraph the quote from St. Augustine, St. Augustine's Confessions, which is known as "My weight is my love," because he realized when he reached his weight, he was able to love God. this is a non-sectarian book, but it's still that progression that's one of the things that I care most about in the book, that it's something happened in the course of these events that allowed me finally to be able to love someone else. And, the readers can find that for themselves or not, but the St. Augustine quote, which I found by accident, and as I started writing, took on greater and greater significance. And as I was writing draft after draft, and I never looked at it. It was only when I finished that I looked at it again, and I thought, oh my God, that's really uncanny that I chose that.
Right. Well, thank you, John. I think we're going to see if there are any questions, unless there's something else you want to say. There's a question I didn't ask that you'd like to.
Well, I think the only thing that I want to say, if there are people who are interested in writing about their experiences, and memoir is a very sort of tempting form for a lot of people. Everyone kind of wants to write their story or have their story be written or told. And one of the things, my guiding principle here was to tell it as the boy, not to tell it as a reminiscence, looking back from, yes, I'm this age now, but I'm not looking back. I'm writing it as I lived it. So I would just say, if you're thinking about writing something like that, consider it. Consider writing it as it was, not as you look back on it now, et cetera, et cetera. Make it, because that will make it alive to other people. That's my 2 cents.
And I would like to say the book is very, very funny. I mean, your parents going to Esselen, the sort of gurus that suddenly show up at home.
Yeah.
There's a lot of very funny stuff. So what you started out writing, a lot of that is still in there.
Absolutely. I mean, I never wanted to eliminate that.
So we do have some questions here.
Okay.
The first one is from Adele. She says, although I come from an extremely different background, I connected with your vulnerability around shame, which I believe is the most toxic of all emotions. Was it difficult to journey into that vulnerability and expose it on the page?
Well, that's a really, that's a good question. But yes, it was difficult, but isn't that the point? I mean, that's, if you can do that, then, you haven't, maybe you've written more than a book. I mean, you've understood yourself and understood how you got to be what you turned out to be. So yes, of course it's difficult. It's like, it's taking, it's like taking that full inventory of yourself, not just what was done to you, but what you did in turn. So difficult is kind of is an understatement. It's excruciating. And yet, without it, as I found out, it's not real. If you just write about everything you're not ashamed by, then really who cares? I mean, not that it has to be an emotional carnage, but it's got to have those elements to it. Otherwise, it's just not believable. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay.
From someone out in the audience, to what extent does the desire to please our parents influence the people we become? Alternatively, to what extent does rebelling against their desires for us influence the people we become?
That's a big question, isn't it? Of course, I think that one of the great topics of memoir is trying to find out who one is, regardless of the prevailing influences on one as growing up as a child. So the rebellion is just as dangerous as the compliance. I mean, and my father really wanted me to be something. My mother really wanted me to be something. I didn't know which of those to choose, or should I be something else? And then how would I discover that? And that's affected me a lot as a parent, because I didn't want my kids to be anything. I just wanted to see who they were. And, that's idealistic in some ways or maybe impractical. And yet, to some extent, maybe it's what's occurred. That, and it takes tremendous forbearance as a parent, as any parent knows, because you want them to be something, or you have some idea in mind for them. And resisting that is really, really difficult, because you have this, my father wanted me to be an investment banker so badly. And I sort of tried, and I put on the suit, and I went to Wall Street every summer I was in college. He helped me get a job, and I really tried, and I just couldn't do it. And I just couldn't do it. So, and he was good about it. He said, okay, that wasn't a problem for him. But he was much older at that point. And I think that a lot of the events that I describe in the book happened when he was much younger. And does that answer the question? A little.
Yes.
It's one of those questions that we could talk about for days, or experts could talk about for days.
So true. Michael, who do you think hope is the right audience for this book? And then to John, the same question.
Well, I think the reason I published this book, quite apart from anything else, was because of how beautifully written it was. It really is. I mean, John, writes poetry, and you can see that in the prose in this book. And so I am hopeful that, it will be read because it's intense, but it's also a thing of beauty. I can't really think about who's going to buy. I mean, I would love people to buy it. I could see it. I could see it as a mini series, because it's there's just so many details that are so, John in his sort of green crushed velvet suits, that there's so much from that period that I had forgotten about. I mean, we both wore platform boots.
Easy, Michael, don't go into too much detail, please.
No, but it was kind of, it was so it's so weird, because it was such a free time. I kept wishing that I had been born in Victorian times or before the permissive society, because I wouldn't have felt I was missing out in the same way. And when I was reading John's book, I remembered that, because there was this whole world going on that, of the cool kids and stuff. And you wouldn't have known that you weren't part of it before that particular era. So I guess that's getting away from the question, but I just think there's so much in it as an evocation of a period that I would hope lots of people would like it. But I didn't publish it thinking, oh, I mean, I'm just not doing this. I'm not capable. I discovered in the record business that if you make a record because you think it's going to sell and it doesn't sell, you're left with nothing. Whereas if you make a record because you want to make it and you think it's great, then even if it doesn't find an audience, it will eventually find an audience. So there's no point in doing something for a specific audience. You should do it because you love it.
Christina, could you ask am I supposed to answer the question? Could you say again what I'm supposed to answer? No, that was.
What do you hope? What do you think or hope is the right audience for the book?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, I really don't. I just, I think that many people, the Vogue reviewers said that it's a different lens on masculinity at that time, and through the eyes of a bookish kid, and so maybe it's just it's for people who are interested in the time, or it's just a different way of seeing it. So I think it's other questions and issues, I think, aren't so aren't timely. They're not linked so much to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're more general.
I would say anyone who loves a good story and great writing would love
Okay.
this book.
Well, I couldn't
say, but that's the audience. So, do you think that your father and your mother would be accepting and possibly forgiving of your beautiful book? Could they accept your truth?
I've thought a lot about that, and I haven't discussed it at all. I think that I think they would be bothered, as other members of my family have been, by stripping the privacy away. But I don't think that they could say that what I'd written was wrong or misleading. And in that same Vogue review, it ended by the reviewer saying that it was both loving and unsparing. And I liked that, because that's how I saw it, loving and unsparing. Not just for other people, but for myself. Of course they'd be hurt. Of course they would be hurt by parts of it. That would be, and as other members of my family have been. And, I don't know, I'm sorry for that. But, at a certain point, I have to write what I saw. And it took me a long time to do that. So.
Well, in the last scene, John, you're asking your father about what happened, and he's just unable to accept it happened.
Well, at that, yes, it's he denies it. He denies it happened. Some of the events that I recount, and it could be his memory had become shaky at that point, or it could be just simply denial. And I don't know which it is, so I don't say. I think it's right to leave that unanswered.
It's interesting. Mary Karr has her book, The Art of Memoir, or The Art of the Memoir. And I remember her saying that she would be afraid to share some of these things with family members. And yet she found that actually everyone loves the idea of being in a book. And they don't always end up being as hurt as you think they are, because they love being part of your story. So
interesting. I haven't read that. I didn't read that book. So of course I've read Mary Karr, but I haven't read that. I see we're getting questions. I see a little number by the questions. So we don't have that much time left. So if can I
done
another one?
Yes, there's one left. We've read all of them,
Oh, okay.
with the exception of how difficult was it to write this book? What were your concerns as you wrote it? It's courageous, beautifully written, and heartfelt. Thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Well, I've talked about that a little bit, but generally, the hard part was to, and this is something a little bit different, it is to write it without anger too, to write it without a sense of vengeance, to see the events in balance and try and get at the cause of them rather than their manifestations, and to really to present them that way. I mean, I don't feel angry. I don't feel rancorous. I didn't want to present my experiences like in that way. I didn't want to amp it up. And there are many people who read this manuscript and who said, well, you need this book to end it's got to have a bigger ending. It's got to have a Hollywood ending. Something dynamic has to happen. And in my way, I listened to them and I thought about them seriously. But then I thought, but that wasn't my life. It didn't, it didn't have a dynamic ending, but perhaps the ending it had was by itself dynamic. That I had, that from my experiences, I wound up having children and being married to the same person for 30 plus years. And, maybe that's dynamic in light of the experiences I had. I don't know, but that's how I'd like to think of it. I don't know what people expected from me, but I had, many, publishing people say, well, it's unfortunate that your life doesn't provide the dynamic ending we're hoping for. It's like, okay, what can I do? This is it. This is all there is.
Great.
Well, we think it's wonderful. And we've been getting lots of orders for this book. So I think there is a great deal of interest. And I just want to remind everyone watching that if you haven't already ordered it, you can order it tonight. Just press on the green button at the bottom of the screen and we'll ship it out to you. Or if you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores and pick up a copy, you can do that too. I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. And those readings were remarkable. Love them. Can I ask you, are you writing? What's next for you? Are you working on poetry? Are you working on something else?
Well, I'm always working on a poem because I just like to have language in my head when I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's like a kind of a puzzle. So I like to have that. But I finished a novel, which Michael may publish, and that before COVID hit and everything, and it's kind of a farce mixed with a tragedy, and as it goes on, it's hard to tell which is which, and I liked having the structure of two parallel stories, which instead of being completely separate from each other, always being in tangency with each other, in struggling with each other, because one story is a farce, one story is a drama. But I didn't want them just to converge in the final chapter. I wanted them to be in communication the whole time. So it's a story based on the creation of an imaginary business product. So it allows my business experiences a chance to roam.
Sounds very intriguing.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much, Books and Books.
Thank you. Thank you for supporting Books and Books by being here tonight.
Thanks. Thanks to everybody who turned in. Thanks to you, Christina.
We can't wait to see you in person
Well,
in Miami
can't wait to be there.
soon. Thank you to everyone watching. And thank you to Miami Book Fair for your partnership. All right. Take care. Be
Bye-bye.
well. Bye.